My name is Fârès Gillon, and I'm currently an associate professor at Aix-Marseille University. And I was, before that, a research associate at the Institute of Ismaili Studies for 3 years. So my area of expertise is early Shi'ism, early Ismailism, with a particular focus on the Fatimid period. But I'm also interested in Shi'ism in general and Islamic philosophy. I was initially trained in philosophy, and I wanted to study Islamic philosophy. The problem is, in France, there are not many places where you can actually do a PhD in Islamic philosophy. So I asked around, and I got in touch with one of the great scholars in Ismaili studies, Daniel de Smet. And he kind of suggested that I worked on this book, the Kitab al-Kashf, which I had heard of, but I hadn't read it. And he said something like, there's this strange and understudied book. Someone should do something about it. And I was young and naive, so I just went for it, and about maybe. Yeah, that was about 15 years ago. So it has been a long journey. I wanted to work on philosophy, and it turned out the Kitab al-Kashf isn't really about philosophy. So, but it was just as interesting, So I discovered a whole new field, which is the study of, the area of early Shi'ism and what we call, or what those groups that were called the ghulat. So obviously it's a very controversial label, but as I say in the book, I still use it for convenience, because when you say the ghulat, well, you know that it's a hagiographical category. So obviously it's not meant as a compliment, but at the same time, when you say the ghulat, well, people in the field at least, have a general understanding of what it entails, as in terms of doctrines. When I started working on the Kitab al-Kashf, the main study, the main references on this book were an article by Wilfred Madelung, and also a few studies here and there, mainly by Heinz Halm, so two great German scholars of Shi'i studies. And Madelung, yes, had this hypothesis that the Kitab al-Kashf was a pre-Fatimid composition, and that probably Jaʿfar ibn Mansur al-Yaman, so the alleged author of the book, brought these texts with him when he moved from Yemen to North Africa. And then it was just transmitted under his name, because he was the one who collected and compiled these texts together. So I don't think Madelung was entirely wrong, but I just think that the context of composition, that is the Fatimid North Africa, has actually much more impact on the text than what Madelung thought. And I believe I have shown in the book that in fact the Kitab al-Kashf is an attempt to systematically legitimate the new dynasty and the imamate of the Fatimid caliphs. And so obviously the text is very elusive, very doesn't ever refer to historical events, doesn't mention historical people, historical characters, except for two. Namely the predecessor of Abdullah al-Mahdi at the head of the Dawah, that is the last pre-Fatimid Imam on the one hand, and his successor, namely al-Qa'im bi Amrillah, so the second Fatimid Caliph. And apart from that, these are the only this is the only evidence we have to date the text. But then when you start reading through it and connecting the dots and saying, well, here the text seems to be alluding to some kind of event or some kind of, for example, it seems to be alluding to dissensions within the Dawah. What could be these dissensions? So then I turn to what we know about the historical events at the beginning of the Fatimid period, and then I was able to suggest a few hypotheses as to what this or that passage may refer to. At first sight, to be a very speculative book, and in fact, it is closely connected to historical events. Madlung had this idea that it might have been, inserted. That it was a later interpolation in the text, and I think, in fact, the text was built around this idea that al-Qa'im is not only the legitimate imam, but even before that, the legitimate heir to Abdullah al-Mahdi. And I think this is the whole purpose of the Kashf, actually, or the major parts, the most important parts of the Kashf are about al-Qa'im. Hence, the picture that I chose for the cover, right? Because obviously it's not about the cover is not about it was taken from a manuscript of al-Hariri's Maqamat, but for me it kind of suggested. Well, I understood it as a portrait of Abdullah al-Mahdi presenting his son and successor and heir to the daʿis, I mean, most of the polemical stance of the Kashf, although it does have a lot of, what some would call anti-Sunni material, this is only about internal polemics. So it's about trying to convince some skeptical daʿis, or maybe daʿis who were a bit perplexed by the new orientations of the Dawah after al-Mahdi proclaimed himself as the Caliph and the Mahdi. Yes, the audience of the book is clearly Ismaili. It is destined to members of the Dawah, or former members of the Dawah, or members of the Dawah who were tempted to join those apostates, so to speak, of the Ismaili Dawah. But it's not at all about polemicizing with Sunnis or with other Shi'is or with the Malikis of the time. You will find this kind of things in other Ismaili works, but this is not the purpose of the Kitab al-Kashf. I think the main interest of the Kitab al-Kashf is the fact that it sheds some light on the doctrinal origins of Ismailism, and that it allows us to connect it more closely to early Shi'ism. I think the problem with the history of early Ismailism is that we kind of consider early Ismailism as equating the works of what Madlung called the Persian school, so works of al-Nasafi, Abu Hatim al-Razi, and Abu Yaqub al-Sijistani, who were all philosophers. And then when you study the corpus of works attributed to Jaʿfar bin Mansur al-Yaman and the Kitab al-Kashf in particular, it appears that there is no philosophical concepts in there, and that the main source it's not philosophy, it's Shi'ism in general. And I think one of the things that I wanted to do with this book is also to show that Ismailism is not just one branch of Shi'ism. You cannot say that there's on the one hand Shi'ism and then on the other hand Ismailism. Ismailism is Shiism, maybe not Shiism by itself, but it should be understood as a Shi'i trend in its own right, and even probably the earliest well-organized or institutionalized Shiism, in fact, because this movement of institutionalization took place at the beginning of the 10th century. That is long before the 12er Shia did so themselves. In fact, the 12er Shia did not really were in the process of organizing themselves and their doctrine and their community at a time when the Ismailis already had their Fatimid Caliphate and had been going through this process for quite some years. So not all scholars agree on this, but I believe that there's a general process in the history of religion that orthodoxy emerges as a construction after the fact. The initial fact being so-called heresy or heterodoxy, and you see this in the case of the history of early Christianity, where or the Christian orthodoxy was progressively built through a series of councils, and in each of these councils they would put aside certain doctrines and stating that these doctrines are not part of our beliefs. And this is how you construct an orthodox, a so-called orthodox tradition. And this is a process you can also observe in Islam, in the Islamic context, and particularly in the Shi'i contexts, plural. The Kitab al-Kashf represents some of the first steps of the Fatimid Ismaili Caliphate to affirm their orthodoxy by saying, well, it is true that we have a particular interest into the esoteric aspects of religion, so the batin, but, and this is the major thing, but actually the zahir is just as important, and we as Fatimid caliphs are the guardians of both the batin and the zahir. And I think this is where you see this real process of construction of an orthodoxy, of an institutionalization of religion. The Kitab al-Kashf has indeed been understudied, but I think since it was published by Rudolf Strothmann in 1952, it was always considered by the scholars, the specialists in Shi'i studies, as an important text, because it was, well, first of all, because it's the most ancient Ismaili text to have survived to the present day, the most ancient available Ismaili text. Probably there are other texts, but we don't have them because, as you know, access to Ismaili sources is a bit complicated. So so it has always attracted the attention of scholars because of this. And many scholars even have been cherry picking passages from it, but what it really needed, I think, was a general overview, a general synthesis. And I think, apart from my commentary, I think one of the main achievements, I would say, of this book is not only the translation, but also my attempt to highlight the structure. I think this is very important for our understanding of this very difficult, very obscure texts. And I think the whole question of the structure of the book is essential. It's the first step. So I don't think my book, unfortunately, I think in 20 years from now, I'll still have some new things to say about the Kitab al-Kashf, and probably other scholars might have new things to say. But at least now I've laid down some foundations to clarify a little bit the text as a whole.